Hello there out there in TV land. And welcome to the Monday Airwindows Livestream, where I will answer your questions whenever somebody actually shows up to be asking questions of, which is bound to happen at some point, surely. That's the way this works, is I started off and people sort of filter in, but you can't actually show up until the stream is on. So it's going to start off a little more slowly, as always. I have just released Channel 7, and Channel 7 is the morning CG. Channel 7 is a upgrade on channels 5 and 6 on a number of bases. Like one of them is it uses the fix for high frequency slew rate clipping that I have in Interstage, because it was worked out that that one, hey David, Interstage was producing a problem, because if you went to high sample rates, it started to take effect too aggressively and too quickly. And it turns out that same issue was there, Ahmed, was there in channels, so it was worth going and fixing that as well. And the other improvement was, since I had spent some effort trying to get a version of the channel algorithm that would work to combine the two algorithms, like combine spiral and density, because people were saying, I like spiral, but I also liked the fatness density had. I was trying to make an algorithm that would just do that out of the gate, and what I got out of that was Mojo and Dino, neither of which sound like spiral or density. So that ended up being kind of weird. They produced entirely different algorithms that wasn't like either of the two initial ones. And sort of the bottom line there is sometimes it's the simple thing to do. It turns out to be the best thing to do. And the simple thing to do in that case was to just generate both algorithms and crossfade between them. So that's what the channel 7 gain thing, which now goes to 200%, does, is it goes from dry to spiral, which is the more subtle of the two effects. And then it goes from spiral to density by crossfading between the two. And that lets you dial in as much of the thickness that you want. I don't think I can demonstrate peaks only unless I was to put it on my microphone at the moment. Maybe at some point in the future I will have live streaming actual mix situations, and that would be useful. That's probably worth experimenting with. I might need to run an extra computer to do that. It's hard to say. But description I can try to do. So as far as using peaks only, it is a mixed check. You're not actually trying to make it sound good all by itself. What you're doing is much like if you turned on slew only or subs only, which are also mixed check things available in monitoring. I do have paper and pen, so I can do that, but I'm not sure that writing stuff on paper would even matter here. Peaks only reveals what's going on in the sound in a characteristic way. So the purpose of it, and we're assuming that it's not, your mix shouldn't be like hyper loudinated. If you're mixing, you shouldn't be mixing in a situation where it's like, oh yeah, I have to peak limit the result of this super hard because that's just my sound, man. You don't want to be doing that. What you do in mixing is go at a moderate level by turning your speakers up and then just not slamming the bus necessarily too hard. And oddly, the way that works, like if this is quietness and this is full clip, music has peak energy. And if you record stuff directly and you're working about mixing it down, and this is something that I ran into on the plugin Righteous, is you can have your basic loudness of the main music and have that be fairly quiet and still have peaks be clipping your output. So if you had a soft clipping level that was a little farther down, or something like Spiral will be gradually cutting off the peaks and saturating them slightly. You can have stuff relatively quiet and still wind up clipping some of the peaks off, especially in digital recording, because digital recording doesn't really take out peaks for you at all. Like if they get into the converter, they're going to be there forever until something else happens. And in analog gear, that's not so much the case. In analog gear, a lot of stuff like that, like you can have these dots represent individual samples. Suppose you've got a really bright sound, and your samples are here, and then one is like way over here, and then they're back into the normal zone again. Because something happened that was very bright, like you tapped something hard, and it caused a brief high-frequency peak to happen. If you had that in an analog system, especially one that was based on tape, you're going through so many transformers and things as the process of recording onto tape, because that's what a tape head is it's like a little transformer that's encoding information into iron oxide. And it's going to tend to take down that peak simply because it's a high frequency phenomenon. If you're going through a analog mixing desk, it's probably going to be rolling off some of the super highs, and that's also going to end up having the isolated peaks cut back. But in digital, nothing like that ever happens. So you have your single high sample forever until something else happens. The idea of using peaks only as a mix check is that it'll smooth out these really loud peaks in here in such a way that you'll be able to hear what they're doing, and it's smoothing stuff off a little bit. And part of the reason this talk sounds like bond us mortals is because I'm kind of talking in circles and not engaging with that question very well. Honestly, as I see it, the answer to how do you use peaks only is turn it on and listen to it. It should show you what is too loud. That's the whole idea. Like if you're working on but how do I apply it, then you're probably overthinking it. It should be showing you what is too loud, much like subs only should show you which bits in the extreme bass are too loud. And slew only should show you only the high frequency stuff and give you a rough idea of what in that is too loud or not loud enough. So the how to use peaks only is pretty much like turn it on and see if something sounds completely and totally wrong level wise. That's basically the bottom line there. CG was asking how to use logical and compressors in broken beat music. I think that would depend upon what broken beat music is, because I've never heard that reference. I'll finish off my coffee, or what there's left of it, and try to get up to speed with the questioning today. Broken beat music presumably is kind of stop-start stuff where your volume levels aren't all going to be consistent, and that will give a issue with compression. Because if you're trying to get the same compressed result at radically different levels, you're going to run into a problem. And getting a groove going isn't necessarily a matter of even compression, unless your notion of groove depends upon having the compression swing back up again in volume after beats have pushed the level down. Like if you're looking for a sidechainy thing, like that's sometimes when people do that, that's not even a compression. It sounds like it is, but it's actually an LFO. Like I know deadmau5 is very well known for doing stuff like that, and it sounds like sidechain compression, but sometimes what he's doing is not actually sidechain compression. It's a LFO that is manipulating the background of something, and it could even be a reverb or a synth pad or something like that. But the idea is that you duck something out when a beat hits, and it makes it sound like compression pumping and swaying, but it's more controllable if it's an LFO. Like this first page is useless and didn't really do a very good job of writing stuff. Like compression works like if you've had a loud sound hitting here, it can drive the volume down and then it starts swinging up again. Again, I'm drawing terribly today, but if you use an LFO, you can do a weird thing like that, or you can have a strangely shaped LFO like that, or a simple, purely linear sawtooth wave. And if that's what you're trying to do with compression, then it's probably worth looking into doing something different for that. It's interesting that somebody's using surge tide. CG is using surge tide for that. I keep grabbing for this thing which is not the pen. I should show you what this is. So I have some further ideas as far as being able to put together stuff that's physical stuff and not always plugins for everything. Look at this. I'm trying to build something else. This is going to be a mixer for me. Oh, interesting. So I would never have called that broken beat, but syncopated is the language that I use for it. And I suppose that that's a term that people use. Are you sidechaining your drum and bass or whatever into a channel that you're trying to manipulate with the compressor? Because there's a fairly direct answer to that. If you need to have your syncopated stuff working and you need the response of the compressor to be more consistent in your sidechaining it, then just make an entirely separate thing and run that into the sidechain instead. And as far as making a compressor swing, I would think that that's probably what you'd want, is for it to, if you're using a compressor for it, then it's presumably because you want it to react to what the kick is really doing rather than being an LFO. So it doesn't seem like that's necessarily a problem. Anyways, I was going to show this off because I've been working on it. It is I'm going to build a mixer and show people how to do it. And it's going to show up in the Instagram and stuff. I'll start taking pictures of these things. I'm going to be working on this on Tuesday because I'm going to be able to get over to a little hobby shop in Keene, New Hampshire. And hopefully I'll be able to find this extremely thin copper tubes, or maybe brass tubes if I can't find copper tubes, because I'd like to have a tube conductor for wiring some of this stuff too. And that's partly because it'll have double skin effect on the wire, partly because it'll be a heavier gauge, and partly because if I'm soldering to a tube, which is like, if I'm soldering to a solid wire, I got to heat the wire up. If I'm soldering to a tube, then the connection only needs to heat up the section of tube, and I should be able to solder to that more effectively. So I'm kind of enthusiastic about getting that going, but I'm also enthusiastic about this. I have a new kind of faceplate. And when it's assembled, it'll wind up looking like that. And this is also something from the hobby shop, and something that I am enjoying. You can kind of see as I start to put it together, there will be no dials on, no nuts, not dials, nuts on these, because the thickness of this faceplate is thick enough that I wouldn't be able to fit a nut on it, so I'm going to need to glue this all in place. It makes for sort of strangely temporary devices where if the jacks go, I'll have to build another one. But hopefully it'll be affordable, accessible enough that that's a reasonable suggestion, that I can just build one, and if that wears out, I can build another, come up with a better way of doing it. But here's what I'm doing here. This is made like this, and I have an idea for assembling the mixer as well, but I'm going to be working on like hardware designs. I'm going to see whether maybe I can't build the amplification stages of the mixer out of transistors, like straight up transistors rather than op amps. I do have a bunch of good op amps. I just wonder whether I can do better. And I also wonder whether I can make a circuit that'll do better and will also take in one-ended stuff and give me a balanced output. Basically, I'm looking to get a phase splitter, and these jacks, which are nice Switchcraft jacks in 1/4 inch, are going to be balanced outputs. And these are probably going to have the knobs on them, or the nuts, not knobs. What am I talking about? But yeah, the idea is, here's the layout of the thing. It's going to be an LCR mixer. So there's the center stage, which is these jacks. And then there's a left and a right, or a right and a left, depending upon which way I want it. And they go to what is essentially 6 different buses. But how that's going to work is maybe just 4 different buses. But I'm going to have sort of 2 parallel mixers. And you can see that there's 9 across. So it's 9 little inputs, 9 little inputs, 9 little inputs. The resistances for each of these are going to be like a megohm, 470K, and like 220K, although that might be too small. For the purpose of having the stuff closer to the outputs be louder. And then you go farther away and it starts mixing stuff quieter, and then the rest of the gain trimming I do with the individual modules that can have their own gain controls on them. So there would be no controls on this. It would basically be a giant summing bus, but it's capable of doing mostly center sounds and then also pairs of left and right things, or just patching stuff into left and right as stereo feeds. And the way that would work, I think, is the stereo buses are separate things, and they run into separate transistors. And then the center bus, each input goes to two separate buses. It goes to a left and a right one. And that way you can combine the two for left, meaning the full-on left and the center section, into a circuit that goes to the output, rather than making everything have to have a pan pot, which ties everything close together. So a lot of this is just, I've been working on these ideas for some time, and I'll be trying to get it together. I'll let you know how it works. But it's like I've spent a lot of time getting together stuff like this, making little Eurorack things on purely pegboard, and I have a whole bunch of pegboard set aside that could be used for that, and I wanted to start doing weird stuff with that and showing how to do DIY things. And it also looks really cheesy if you build stuff out of pegboard. So the idea is maybe I can come up with a concept for using the pegboard for putting some of the parts on, but then showing people how to build stuff that looks like this, which is literally mahogany. It's stained using linseed oil, and I think it's probably straight up linseed oil, but it might have been a furniture finish type, which is about the same thing. And I have tea soaking in the oil, and my hope was I was going to be able to get color from the tannins out of the tea and transfer into the oil. I'm not sure how well it's working. I feel like maybe it's not as working as well as I'd hoped. But the idea is to make a oil that is also kind of staining, but using very natural techniques. And that's because in a hobby store, you can get stuff like this that I was also brandishing earlier on. And this is what a mahogany plank actually looks like when you buy one in a hobby shop. And this is a thin piece of plywood, also from a hobby shop. If you go to a place like that, they're probably going to have, little bins in which you have lots of stuff like that, because people, build model railroad things and such with those. And you could make a module out of that and carve it up fairly easily, do stuff like that. But it's not going to look like furniture grade. It's not going to look all fancy like this. So I'm working on sort of improving that. I'd like to get it sort of better, come up with a way of making it so that if I build something like that and then sold it to somebody or showed people how to do it so that they started doing stuff for themselves, if they followed the instructions, they'd be able to build sort of like handcrafted electronics using very cheap parts. Like these pieces of wood were about $4 or so. And in theory, it's possible to get much cheaper than that, but you can get a single piece of wood and do this with it for like $4. And that's a lot better than having to design some kind of thing and have a company fabricate it for you, like carve aluminum or whatever. Go to some company that can extrude and design the things. This is very homebrew. This is very, you can make it yourself. So there is oil finish, and that's sort of soaked through this very thin piece to the point where it even came out the other end. So this was more just brushed on rather than putting a large amount and soaking it in. And it's glued together, and I put some books and stuff on top of it until I was able to laminate these two kinds of things. And you could also take two thicknesses of the mahogany, which is actually a very rigid board, so it's pretty good at not warping, and just put them crossways, and you're making your own plywood doing that. So let me have a quick look at some of the other questions going on. As far as trying to succeed, Rupert Neve, I don't think I can really get to that level, but if anybody is willing to try, or better yet, because here's something interesting that I'm going to even have to pull out another piece of paper for. You can do two separate ways of going into an op amp if you're mixing stuff together. So this would be an op amp. It's a thing where you have a minus and a plus input, and it's a little chip. Typically it's a little chip. You can get sort of homebrew ones. And a single-ended output. And the whole idea is that it can take in balanced input and reject noise on a single-ended input and do good amplification, good low noise amplification that can amplify a lot. Here's the thing. If you're mixing stuff, typically what you're doing is taking many outputs, many channels, and running through resistors to get to this point where everything gets mixed and combined and amplified. Here, I'm going to have a quick look at the questions because I do have a pile of questions. The more people that show up, the more I'd like to actually attend to their questions as best I can while I go. So let's see. Rupert Neve, new evergreens much better. Yes, I think so. I had to go to some trouble to get a vinyl playback that was working better, and I fixed many things. So I'm doing them over again. I did the White Album over again, and I'm going to do Rumors over again, and then I'm moving on to Tres Hombres from ZZ Top. I am using Reaper for the evergreens. That is my way of capturing the little microphone here and the vinyl playback and combining them. And I'm liking it. I have not yet started using Reaper, although I think I would be able to, I think it'll show me. I haven't found out yet. I don't remember what it did, actually. Reaper does let you use audio units on the Mac, but I forget what kind of interface it showed. But I've not yet started demoing the plugins in Reaper, but that's probably going to happen too. Because the way Apple's going with some things, I'm turning in other directions so that I can like maintain more backwards compatibility with stuff, which in some cases Apple might be moving away from backwards compatibility, and I can't just go for that. I have to continue supporting stuff. So yes, I have started using Reaper. I'm using it for the evergreen stuff, and I'm enjoying it. And when I put together kits of plugins and things, I might even be supplying like Reaper templates or different kinds of templates for different kinds of things. There's obviously going to be a limit to how many different kinds of DAWs I can support directly by just giving working templates of. Headphones broke. These are HD 280 Pros. I don't think they're that great compared to super high-ender headphones, but they're fairly respectable. So I'm using Sennheiser HD 280 Pros. Like, you can literally see on the side of the thing. That is what it is. You don't have to take it apart and wire new stuff into it like I have. But that is what these are. So, and I may say they have held up pretty well, even though I did terrible things and made them really strange. So, yeah, if you're being very price sensitive and stuff, and this is your low cost option, given that you're already not getting like HD 600s or something like that, because Sennheisers are pretty darn good as far as your audiophile headphone options, and I'm not aware that things like the Sonys or whatever are really in the same zone. They're kind of different audiences, I think, in some ways. So for you, I would say go to the HD 280 Pros. It'll save you a little bit of money, and these are working fine for me. Let's have a bit of look. Does subs only in monitoring add gain? Yes, it is a calibrated level, but it is a calibrated level where it's going to wind up like if you have sound that is sort of filling up the full range, like it's going up to clipping, and you kick in subs only should also be going up to clipping, but it should sound like the low end of your track and not be too weird or strange. Like it shouldn't be obliterating things, it shouldn't be fading away, and you should still be able to make out all of your bass elements. It is not a accurate anything. Subs only is like a weird extra processing. It's as radical in its own way as peaks only is. But when you do it, it should be giving you a gain level, an audio level that's comparable to what you had. Probably not wildly louder, probably not wildly quieter, much like Sluice only is not meant to be wildly louder or wildly quieter. And it should basically balance. Like what you hear out of subs only should be essentially balanced. So it's all kinds of adding gain and it's compression and saturation. It's not literally compression, but it's saturating the lows, and it's doing it so in such a way that it's super far away from just an equalized lows. Subs only is a very radical effect that's almost like a bass amp or something. So don't treat it as if it's just an EQ. It's much more. Yeah, I will be. The Rumors isn't going to sound as different as the redo of the White Album did, because the White Album one was very. That was pretty rough. First time out, that was rough. And the take on Rumors was honestly a lot better, but I was still doing like your needle drops. What I've got now, I can actually show you. Let me first fire up OBS so that I can see what my mic is pointed at, or my camera is pointed at. And here we go. Nope. This is what you're using to, it is a RD11 Ariston transcription turntable, and this is the mat that I have on it. At the moment, I'm thinking I'm going to get a deerskin mat because that's something that you can do that works better for some of these contexts. And the preamplifier there is what's powering it. And this gain control is what I didn't have accessible because it was originally sitting behind that, sort of in that enclosure, and I couldn't reach it. This is now very easily reachable, and I turn it up to about this much for doing the tracks. So, and I even have a light that shines across the groove so I can see where the needle is going to go. And it goes dim, bright, and really bright, and then blink, which I don't actually need. And I've bolted that onto the rack rail. So yeah, this is the new Evergreen setup. It was not all that difficult or expensive to get because it turned up in a local music store that doesn't really handle turntables and things. So it was a bit of a, it was their good fortune that I was even there in the first place to get it. And it turned out to be a good choice. I mean, you heard it in the remaster. So it's doing a good job on that. So, back to that. David's asking questions about it. Is dim? Honestly, David, I think that some of your best. Go ahead and ask your questions, but I'm guessing that you're crazily experimenting around with stuff is going to bear more fruit. Like, you're willing to do stuff that is not reasonable, and that's where things are discovered. I had a conversation with my brother just this last weekend about that kind of stuff, which I'll probably bring up later. And I was in the middle of explaining this, but I'm gonna keep looking at the chat here, because as the numbers of this chat slowly increase, I'll be working harder at following everything because I'm still trying to do it within 2 hours. I could have a future Patreon thing where I start doing things for 3 hours, but funnily enough, the Music Jam dialed back to 75 minutes so that I could do CD length things. And I'm still working out, like, what kinds of stuff I can produce out of that, what kinds of music I'm actually making out of that. But, yeah, and I'm glad you folks, that is very much something that I approve of. If the folks that come here get along with each other, because that's a natural thing that happens, and that's also where good stuff happens. Like, the reason you had things like the Writers Algonquin Roundtable in, I believe it's the 1930s, was because a bunch of New Yorker writers were getting together socially and hanging out, and it's Dorothy Parker, Robert Benchley, bunch of Algonquin, and Algonquin was apparently the hotel, I believe. And they were socializing and taking an interest in each other, and it became a thing, and a lot of neat writing came out of that. The Inklings, which is Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and Charles, somebody, I forget, there was a bunch of folks who went by the Inklings, and they got together and sort of had beers in a pub a lot. There's a fellow named Hugo Dyson who was part of that crew. Tolkien's son got involved at some points. But they got together and formed a thing. And there was a cyberpunk group that put together a thing called the Turkey City Lexicon. And that was also a social group that got together and had a common interest in something to talk about, but then just got to know each other. So anytime this happens, there's a lot of potential for greatness. And that is every bit the case for you folks hanging out on my live stream, because it's going to be here on Mondays. And any of you that are that are my patrons can also jump on the Discord that I have for that. And that is a, non-Mondays way of catching up. I have always intended that people should be able to talk with each other there as well, or indeed in some entirely separate place. If you could make your own Discord server, I would happily link to it. And it would be like, yeah, this is the Airwindows crew Discord server. Maybe if somebody wants to do that, it's kind of like the Facebook group, which I don't control. But if it naturally happens, then that is fine. It doesn't have to all be about me. Coding plugins directly in Reaper, that's interesting. So, yep. Sennheiser HD800s, I think mine are 650s. I'm going to have a quick look. This is actually fun to show. This is what I work on as far as monitoring stuff in, I'm powering that off of my Lavry. It's a DA10. It has a really powerful headphone thing. And these are HD600s, but they're a little unusual because I have modified the heck out of them. So this is what I use. It is essentially a Sennheiser HD600 in which I obliterated all of this stuff. I took the back off of it. I stripped this part down until there was nothing but the plastic. And then I sealed up all the areas of the plastic as much as I could to sort of make a more base seal inside it. And then I covered other bits of it with aluminum tape, which you can get fairly cheaply in places, because aluminum tape is able to damp some resonances because it has the adhesive on it, so it's a constrained layer viscous damping. And as you can see, I could destroy these by just poking them with my finger. There is nothing between the diaphragm and my ear, and there's also just about nothing between the back plate and my ear. And this is my way of trying to enhance the high-endiness of these headphones and be able to hear everything that they produce. So don't take these out on gigs, folks, because somebody will get drunk and poke them and they will die. But that is what I do with my Sennheiser HD600s. And I've had those around forever as well. But one of the things about those is I don't think it would really work as well if I didn't have the Lavry, because that's a very serious headphone amp as part of the Lavry. The Lavry is capable of driving speakers to like little boombox levels. It's an insanely powerful headphone amp. So Sennheisers with bigger numbers are probably going to require a headphone amp that has some seriousness to it. Let's see how far this has gone. Okay, I gotta skip ahead faster. Doop, doop, doop. Yep. Subs only. What do I think about Andy Sneap's mixing style? I don't know that much about it. But it's one of those things where if somebody comes up with a really recognizable thing, it's probably because they're making a set of decisions the same way each time. And that is valuable in its way. I'm going to have to skip forwards. And yeah, HD 800 goes low, but there is no feel to it. That's a headphone problem. You're correctly identifying that. David, no, I'm given to understand that is a high quality turntable mat. Everybody seems to like it in the audiophile world. So yeah, I mean, one of my best friends up here in Vermont is a hunter. You know, we're up here in Vermont, so it's like, yeah, you basically behave responsibly around that kind of stuff. You know, as if you were a Native American, and you honor. If you're going to kill something, you honor it and behave responsibly around it. You're not just going like, oh, I'm going to get my automatic weapon and kill a bunch of stuff just because I can, then I'll just leave it sitting there. It's like, no, you give thanks and conduct yourself with some responsibility. And for that reason, it's like, actually, that is a respectful treatment of a material, is turning it into a hard-to-replace audiophile thing that is better than other stuff that you can get. And it's like, I don't know. I mean, I'm talking to a set of vegetarians here, so it's like I've drifted in that direction a little bit, but I'm still making omelets for breakfast. And there's a whole... We're not going to get into all of that sort of thing so much, unless people really need to, and then we're going to have a conversation. But my point being, yes, the deerskin turntable mat. It's being made by some guy who is doing his own little business, kind of like I do my little business with Airwindows, and he's selling on Amazon, and I wish him the best of luck with that, because it's going to get him in a lot of... I think that if that works out well enough, Amazon is going to set somebody up in China or something to do the same thing and then undercut him. But I'm going to keep scrolling. Evergreens, can we see your pictures? Evergreens is becoming a podcast. I mean, I can't, there's nothing that I can do with video that's not going to get me just copyright struck. One thing I could do is put up the entire collection of evergreen stuff, and that's going to be some work, but I do have the pictures made already. So as far as tying the pictures to what I'm doing the podcast about, that's going to be more difficult, but I can put up those pictures independently. And I think that might be worth doing. Keep skipping because we're diving into a topic that is of interest to my crew, but it's not an audio topic as much. It is dim 2. Doesn't edisdim already do that? I think edisdim might already do what you're talking about as long as you know how to use it. I feel like that has, doesn't it have sliders? It's an interesting suggestion, though. I'll make a little note of that, some way of calibrating it so that you can use the control and then get it back. That said, it's easier for me to do, you can't go halfway to mid-side. That is not a thing. You go from left-right to mid-side, which is a completely other thing, and then I can make the balances of those be different. Like the sides be a lot louder, and then you can put it back, and I think edisdim might already do that, but I can't combine left-right, make them go to mid-sides, and then also include left-right at the same time and be able to decode it again. So that's an interesting question. Let's see. I'm going to want to scroll back down again pretty soon. Is it? Yeah. Infinite sustainer like EBO in a plugin, MV. In a sense, I'm already doing that with MV, because if you set MV to infinite sustain, it will actually do that. So MV, I've already done it, and it's more a question of how do you use it effectively. And it's not going to sound like an EBO, because an EBO is a physical process and it drives a single string, and there is nothing in the plugin world that can take an arbitrary sound and just loop it seamlessly, making it sound exactly like that, and then leave it that way. Or if there is, it's another story entirely. It's not the kind of plugin that I make. MV is the ambience thing, and that can be used to make a sustaining thing like that. And transitioning into replacing the input sound with a presumably a looping delay section, and then just keeping that going, you're going to get a seam in there. I made a plugin called Glitch Shifter where I struggled and tried to make that work better. I don't feel it really worked as well as I'd like. I'm glad somebody's doing Dirty Plug, because I had promised to do that and I haven't got it done yet. Freezes a note. I can't do a full hard rock music stream because I don't have a band. I can put guitars on things, and I can play bass, and I could even start doing songs and let people be part of the stream, and see me tracking stuff, which would involve a lot of pauses and a lot of doing takes on things. So that'd be, I think, a lot less involving Although it would be something that people could watch. But yeah, can't do a rock music stream all by myself. Um, yeah, Tourette's is mentioning the images from the Evergreen study. And the thing about that is I am. Because what's going on in those images from the original talking about the live streaming, or talking about the Evergreen stuff, is the peak energy is a lot hotter than people think, and then the RMS energy only goes up so much. And if you look at the pictures, if you look at those charts and things, you can see how much RMS is in given pieces of music. If you listen to especially the new Evergreen podcast, then you can hear what that sounds like. But when I talk about it, all I'm saying is, yeah, the peak energy is a lot hotter than you think. This is what it sounds like when you're hearing that. And this is where the RMS level actually is. And when people make stuff super loudinated, they're making the RMS level as much as like 20, 24 dB louder than it would naturally be. And so when I say don't do that, leave stuff the way it is, that is talking about those levels. But showing the pictures of them is about the size of that. Oh, also, guys, I think I may actually be able to afford getting the chimney thing replaced so that the birds don't get endangered by my stove. I think I may have gotten to the point where I can do that. And that reminds me that I need to ask about having that done. The guy that is able to do it for me might still have time this fall to do that, and then the birds will be safe from getting stuck in my stove ever after, and I'll be safe from getting stressed by them. So, burbs. Burbs. I will remember to do that. How do you get a Fairchild-style processor? If you mean a VeryMu, there's a plugin that I've already got out called VeryMu, and you can try that. And I've also got a plugin called Pressure, which has a control in it called Mewiness, and you turn that to maximum mewiness rather than inverse mewiness, and that creates a more of a VeryMu style behavior. The Fairchild style of compression is VeryMu compression, and what that means is that rather than the compression just going as a consistent amount of turning stuff down more, or hitting a knee where it's like at this point it just distorts, it never gets any louder than this. VeryMu means that your compression gradually changes from a lower ratio where it's dialing it back a little bit to a full-on infinite ratio, nothing ever gets any louder, and it gradually goes between those two states, and that's what VeryMu means. So the Fairchild is noted for being a classic old tube-based VeryMu compressor. Auto gain volume writer, I would look at Curve, I would look at Recurve, and I would look at Surge and Surge Tide, because those are the slower response. Also, Buttercomp acts a little bit like that too. So as far as auto gain, auto volume type stuff, look to the really slow compressions for those things. And also to curiosities like Surge and Surge Tide, which react so slowly to things that, but these are not for setting the LUF at loudness units full scale. Is what LUFS stands for, loudness units. That's not really for setting your mix loudness units, because that's something that you should be doing as a mixing engineer based on what kind of sound you want out of things. there is many of these things that I feel are not about leaving it to plugins. Be like, you're supposed to use this plugin and get this loudness unit for your mix. It's like, well, what's happening in the mix? What are you doing in the mix? What kinds of sounds are you making happen? How are they relating to the noise that you're trying to make? Because that's way more important than like, oh, you need -18 LUFS for your mix. It's like, well, but what's in the mix? What is the sound? What is the music? These are questions that are primary rather than secondary. That comes first. The numbers and the settings come afterwards. Your Paco is asking about auto gain compensation into channel 7s. I get that people want gain compensations, and I don't want to do that because if it's really that important, you shouldn't be using channel 7 in the first place. When you do things like distortions, it's not about going like, well, in turning my guitar up to get more saturated sound, it automatically turned me down so that I knew what I was doing. It's like, you gotta learn that stuff. These are things you gotta learn. It's not supposed to do it for you. You can reference it, but you also need to listen to, like, what is the saturation level doing? Yes, it got a little bit louder as I pushed it harder, but then also what? Or I turned the output level down, and then also what? It can't just automatically volume match everything. People want that for a variety of good reasons, and one of them is that plugin developers often cheat by doing stuff like that. They go, oh, this sounds so much better, and their processing plugin that models Pultec or whatever it is also made stuff 3 dB louder. And they go, doesn't this sound louder? And it's a cheat. My stuff, you don't have to buy it to use it, so it's like there's nothing to be gained from cheats like that. And I don't do boost. I don't do like marketing boosts in things. When there's boosts in things, it's because it's going into a fixed level saturation stage that applies to whatever you're doing. And then the drive going into that is essentially a gain trim on the front. And then I'm keeping it as simple as possible in some cases, like curve or indeed recurve. It's not even giving you a control for how hard you drive into it. Curve doesn't even do anything like that at all. Curve always makes the volume quieter because there's no gain trim in it, because it's that simple. There's almost nothing to it. It's like a line of code. And part of that is so that people trying to use that in their own plugins for whatever reason can have it be the simple line of code. But part of it is because there's less moving parts. There's less stuff happening in the plugin. It is a simple concept, which is this audio process doing this thing, and it's a distortion, so it makes it quieter. Or it's a distortion that you can push harder, so it makes it quieter, and then you can pre-boost into it. And I strongly do not believe in doing all the compensation so that everything is level matched and stuff. It's like level matching an EQ. If you adding 12 dB at 1K and stuff, EQs don't routinely go like, okay, here's your 12 dB at 1K, and this is compensating for everything else, because it's like, okay, well then Fletcher-Munson effect, if you boosted it at 1K, that's going to be more obvious than if you boosted 10 dB at 10K or 100 Hertz. And so are you going to automatically gain correct those things as well? In that case, which gain correct would you do for adding 10 dB at 100 Hertz or 10 dB at 10K or 10 dB at 1K? If you add 10 dB at 1K, then you're automatically going to need a bigger gain correction to get it back down again to level match it. And it becomes, a big cluster fluff. I simply don't agree with the idea that that's something that people should be doing. Instead, you got to take responsibility for comparing it, or simply know in your gut, like, oh, I made something be louder. Therefore, don't trust that it's automatically better. Instead, go, I made it louder because I wanted it to be more saturated, because making something more saturated is going to sit it a little farther forwards in the mix, and maybe that's what I wanted. And making something louder isn't necessarily going to make it be forward in the mix, but all this stuff is very subtle anyhow. You can't get to a point where there's going to be enough compensations that you can be truly unbiased. Nothing is ever truly unbiased. Instead, you're trying to get a end result, and that's way more important than doing unbiased comparisons of things. Let me scroll up because I got on a track of this, and boy, I lost everything else. Special peak display. Yeah, Pure Stare is in the pipeline. That's coming. I'd like to be able to make this as a plug. I've asked my brother for some help in being able to do VSTs with GUI, and if I can, I'll bring that out there. That's the kind of thing that he does really well, is dig into the systems that these are built out of and understand how they are made. He's good at that. I'm not. He doesn't do creative work, but he does that. If I'm able to make the special peak display, it'll be just like that. And as far as releasing my charts on all the podcast releases, I might just put up all of the pictures that I can. An interesting thing is we mentioned Reaper. Reaper has spectrograms built into it. I turned them on. I was like, oh my God, this is exactly what I was doing with the, so honestly, if I can start working with Reaper-y type stuff and they give access to doing these charts and things, it would not be that hard to program in what I was doing with those charts for the RMS stuff. And then you'd have that in Reaper as well. Then I would be quite pleased. I own Reaper. I'd like to push it as far as a more effective thing because I like the way they do stuff. And we'll see. One thing at a time. Dum-de-dum. I have curve on my mic in OBS right now. I'm not sure why it would have muted yours because mine is doing just fine. I'll finish off my last coffee for my second hour of talk because we got a bunch of interesting stuff going on. April 1st. I don't do April Fool's jokes. I'll leave that to like the Stephen Slates of the world. My purpose around these things is pretty serious, so I don't really do pranks and jokes and things. I think I've done weird things and put them out on April 1st if that was a release date. Just because I do weird things sometimes and I'll put them out anyway, so I might as well put them out at a time that people think that it's a joke. But it'll be an actual plugin that does stuff. It just does something that is very unhelpful. So yeah. Ahmed Tres Hombres is coming. I'm doing rumors that'll come out by this Wednesday. And the reason is because I'm not satisfied with the one that I did. And so it will be next Wednesday, after this coming Wednesday, that Tres Hombres, and that's the next in the queue. And then I'll be asking questions about what people want after that. So that is coming. I keep delaying it because I keep wanting to ask Terry Manning if he'll be part of my podcast for that one. And it'd be useless because he would refuse to answer any of the questions. He would refuse to tell me how any of that was done because Billy Gibbons wants it that way. Billy Gibbons likes messing with people's heads as far as like telling them weird things or not telling them the secrets of what was really going on. So part of what I'll be doing in any ZZ Top record evergreens is a lot of speculation and what little I know about it. Because I'm in a place where I will have heard Terry talking sometimes about that stuff, but he's still very coy, even among peers, even among other engineers. Terry doesn't really give all that stuff away. So there are some things like Terry will talk about the synthesizer for, I believe, legs, the ZZ Top Track legs. And he's like, I wonder if anybody will ever figure out the magic stuff that we did with that synthesizer. But I think I made some suggestions as to what I thought that it was, and I don't think I succeeded. But even if I had, he wouldn't have admitted it. Queen Records, I think, might have that. Let me bounce on to... give me back the Evergreens thing. I can load the page, and I'm looking at that now. I'll scroll down to the Q section. I'm going to PQR. What I've got is, it looks like I have the first Queen album. I'm not sure what, it feels like that, I don't remember having the first Queen album, but I guess I must because I wrote it down that way. And then I've got Sheer Heart Attack. I don't think I have Night at the Opera, so that's not a thing right now. It could be in future if I got it. And I do certainly have lots of Bowie, so there's that. Let me continue following these questions as we go. And then I'll get back to talking about mixers because I didn't finish my thought on designing mixers. Yeah, I am enthusiastic about doing some Reaper specific stuff simply because it's like working with the 3D modeler Blender, which has had some recent upgrades and has become a much more approachable system. And Blender is a giant open source project. So what's going to happen typically with this kind of thing is you can have a giant open source project doing something like 3D modeling, or in Reaper's case, it's like everything you ever wanted in a DAW all at once, with options for everything else. And it becomes a little bit overwhelming, but you get a community out of it, and things will gravitate towards one specific answer. Like, there's not a whole pile of 3D modeler open source things. Instead, it's basically Blender, because that was always the big 3D option for open source projects. And so that's where the attention went. And like this, in the same kind of way, you do have open source stuff like Audacity, but Reaper, which is not as much of an open source thing, all the same, it has the energy behind it, and it is a more solid like workstation on something like Linux and so on. So that tends to soak up some of the energy from other DAWs to be fully developed, and things will kind of consolidate into a particular answer. But when the answer has open source support and stuff, like, I think I personally am becoming something like that because you've got Airwindows, and I continue pursuing this stuff and making things for people and making stuff work for people. And then as I keep getting to do more of it, I wind up getting more resources and I'm able to do more. Like, I'm stepping into this hardware thing in hopes of being able to both teach people how to do this and make kits for this kind of stuff available for DIYers, for people who wouldn't be able to, like, if I built this together into a glorious mahogany surfaced shiny and fancy mixing board and then put it on eBay. And people are like, oh my God, it's homemade. I'll buy that for $10,000. And that works out well for me, but it's like people can't get their hands on stuff like this if it goes that way. And if it was very popular, I wouldn't be able to devote like what remains of my life to doing nothing but building stuff and then selling it, because I would be working all the time and never rest and not be able to sleep, and just I would lose my life to that sort of thing. So I have to make DIYer type stuff, and I have to show people how stuff is done, which is very important, even though it's hard to do. Like, you show people how stuff is done, but then it's not all going to be followed. It's things like, okay, here's you do this and you wire the things together, and then this is how you make your faceplate, and you can get this piece of mahogany in the hobby shop, and then this is the kind of oil that you put on it to make it look like the kind of finish rather than this sort of pale. And you learn all of those things, and you learn like you do this, and then if you glue it together first, otherwise it won't glue because it has oil on it, and you learn all that stuff. And people trying to get into that from the get-go, there will be so much that they miss. There will be so much that they don't know. And it's just a daunting task. So you wind up with these consolidations of things, like the Blender project, like Reaper, like me trying to put together these hardware projects that have a DIY quality to them so that I can point you to stuff that you can start putting together your own things, or indeed be the conduit so that, like, if you're a patron, then you can get these things at cost, and I'll send you a little kit of stuff out, and that would please me. That would be nice. It's all very interesting. So we're talking about some of the Evergreens records to be chosen. David Pixley wants OBS to be more like a DAW and Reaper to be more like OBS. Fair enough. If they like doing that, then awesome. I'm not sure, Patrick, you can't work with Reaper, which is a pity. I'm not exactly sure why that would be, but we're running into some plugin problems again, I think. Bo wants to make monitoring change settings randomly. Goodness gracious me. I can't do that for you because that's not going to work for anybody else, I don't think. But you could script it so that if you had monitoring going on, automate the setting and have it go to different things. And you'd have to have your stuff already recorded, and you'd have to use an automation track, and it would be that. Or get something like Reaper and tell it to do a random thing, which I'm not sure how you do that, but I bet there's a way of doing it. Yeah, the helmet with the camera attached to it was a way of doing lip syncing technology. I had a little workflow together for recording actor performances and getting like the face and recording the voice on the little microphone with the camera, and then having it bolted to your head so that you could, in theory, run a automated system that took the input frames coming in and assigned them to some sort of puppeteering in either CG or animation, and you'd either draw your character differently or you'd control puppeteering things on the character. In theory, it would be even possible to do that so that it would automate some of that stuff. Like you watch for differences, and then there'd be a spot where it's like, if you raise your eyebrows, it goes here, and so this pixel becomes darker, and so it automatically raises eyebrows if the pixel becomes darker, and then it automatically goes. All the experimentations, yes. Patrick, I think one of the challenges with Reaper is that they will allow all of the workflows. It's kind of the same problem with Blender, is you get something like Blender and it's like, we give you all of the workflows, and it's like, that's not actually helpful. If I was to do a DAW, and I was talking with my brother about this, I had a conversation with my brother that was really interesting. I'd like to mention before I go, because it was a bit of an intense weekend on that basis. If I was to do a DAW, it would be this very specific thing. Like, most likely, it would work in such a way that it's like a series of buttons, and if you're playing the music and you overdub over using the button, then you're recording into a track like that, and then there would be some way of mixing it together. It maybe would have a console type system, but it would be forcing you into a particular kind of mixing. It'd be forcing you into a particular kind of sound, and it'd be forcing you into a workflow that would be really kind of unusual. And there would be no flexibility to it at all. And because the way that like Reaper and Blender and so on have always done that sort of thing is to be like, oh, we'll solve it. Here, you have all of the interfaces. Here, have all of the workflows. And in doing that, it just becomes overly complicated. It becomes, all of the possibilities are sitting in front of me and I have no idea what to do. And I feel that is a bit of an inspiration killer and not good. But the reason you do it is because if you pick any one thing, most people will be like, that's not exactly what I wanted. And then you go, well, but that's what this is. You pick a guitar, that's not exactly what I wanted. I wanted 4 strings, not 6. And you're like, well, but this is a guitar, so this is how many strings it has. Especially with like the open source projects, you do wind up adding stuff like, and now the feature has this, and now we have this feature. We'll just make the menu longer. And the menus wind up being the size of your entire screen, and you can't keep track of any of them. There's something to be said for handling stuff differently than that. And the challenge there is you do something like super different. And again, most people will not like exactly that. You'd have to learn how to use it, and it would be like its own kind of instrument. It's like, this is a nickel harpa. It is a violin with a sort of rotating wheel, and you hold down little levers to fret strings. So it's like an auto harp, except for that it's like a violin, except for that it also has a little megaphone sticking off of it made out of tin. And it's like, well, that's really weird and dumb. And it's like, but it's a nickel harpa. That's what this is. And some people will end up liking it, and most people will find it ridiculous. That's the sort of thing that I think would be worth doing. And then you do them, and you're never going to hit the mass media with the thing, because by definition, it's not hitting all of the mass markety type things. Thumper, I think you're talking about one of the Teenage Engineering synthesizers, and it is expensive as hell. But there's I think OP1, Teenage Engineering OP1 is something like that. It's this little keyboard that is apparently very nicely built. It's like where I'm trying to build some of my Eurorack stuff and learning how to do it with high quality wood and having it have a nice fit and finish. And that way, Teenage Engineering did their OP1 by making a sort of fine cast aluminum object with these very nice buttons and this very lovely screen that's super clear and bright and colorful. And what they've got there is a synthesizer type tiny workstation that takes a lot of instrument choices and things out of the equation for you. It's just very expensive to get, and I personally wouldn't want one because I don't like the sounds that it has, but it does take those sound questions out of the equation. So there's that. I have no idea what reactable is. I'm sure you've mentioned it before. I don't know what it is. Fix for amp sims in the 2.4K range. Have you tried biquad on that? Have actually good EQ on there? I don't know what else to tell you about that because the fix for amp sims is a whole thing. I do need to put out the cabs plugin, but unfortunately the cabs plugin is trash, and that's the reason it's taken so long for it to come out. And I'm also pretty sure that when I do that, it won't fix your amp sim problems because it's not good. But I do need to put it out because it exists and it was out there before. So before it is super, super late, this is a very chaotic stream, but that's because I only put out channel 7, and there's not much controversial about that. Although I should ask, while I've got you all here, I'm contemplating, while I am revising monitoring, to add those two Oratone style monitoring things, which is mono and then hard left or hard right, so it comes out of only one speaker. That made a lot of sense for me, so I decided to do that. And then there's also another plugin named after a guy. It's Monome from Lanome. And he wanted like literally just full range mono out of left and right speakers and a bunch of other options besides. I was like, okay, I'll give you that one, and it'll be one of the extra spare ones. And this is not generally useful, and it's not part of how I want people to be monitoring. So that is more of the adding extra stuff to confuse matters, and then nobody knows what you're really supposed to be using. So that stuff doesn't get into monitoring. But I'll make a special plugin for it because the guy wanted it so much. Oh my god, Bo is slightly older than me. Cool. I am over 50 myself. Dum-de-dum. Reaper can most certainly crash, Patrick. I'm just not sure when it crashes. Dum-de-dum. I was also going to make the phone simulation be by default mono in the center. Just sort of because that was the whole idea of what that was going to be. There's no real sense to having it be a stereo thing. So I was going to quietly change that as well. And be like, yep, that's how it goes. Tough luck, that's what it is. Because it's more accurately what a phone... It's nothing but a biquad bandpass. So yeah, that's possible to do. I do intend to make that be a mono. And then the Aventone bandpass would also give you hard left and hard right options. And then other stuff is going to be a separate plugin because it's other things that are not really useful options. There's not going to be a separate one that's mono. I'm just going to replace the phone monitoring with a mono one. It all is about refining stuff down to what's actually relevant. And this brings me to the conversation that I had with my brother. Because the thing is that I went out to visit my brother last weekend and show him how to stir fry food because he's having to revise his whole diet ever since he had a stroke and is seeing a dietitian, such stuff like that. And he didn't know how to stir fry stuff or really cook because he's been working as like a corporate computer programmer all of his life, so he didn't have to do such things. He just always take out. And the thing about that is after having showed him that, I cooked him food, and then he cooked me the same thing. And then we sat down and I started talking about a conversation we'd had a little while back in which he came over and I was doing a game that I've been developing. It's codenamed Clusterfluff, and it's on my GitHub. Um, it is a game in the Godot engine. Godot engine is another good open source project that I'd like to further and propagate. And the last time I worked on it, he was watching how I was going through my process. And he kind of looked at me and was like, "It seems like you're making choices at random and you don't think." And that hurt my feelings. I didn't like that. Because this is a very smart guy, but he's accustomed to thinking that only he knows how to program and none of the other programmers know anything. And I wasn't going to take that from him for two reasons. One of which was I was really after something and I would know when I got it. And the other reason is I was developing this game idea and I needed to be able to come up with inspiration. I needed to be able to think of new stuff to try. Because if I was like, "Oh, I suck, I can't actually think, and I'm not really coming up with anything," I'd stop having ideas and it would just stop. I can't work that way. I can't work with this guy. So we had a conversation about it because I told him, "Yeah, that hurt my feelings. You told me that I didn't think. I didn't like that. And you told me that it seemed like I was doing stuff at random. And I get that it seemed like I was doing stuff at random because I was experimenting and trying things very rapidly. And in some cases, it was like, I need this to move like this. And I just tried this and it didn't work. So let's try a couple of permutations on that in this code and see what happens." And I'm observing what comes out. Much like if I was doing a plugin, I might code something and then listen to what it did and try to figure out, like, here's what happened. And it'll tell me something. And so I got frustrated. And I said, "Okay, tell you what, we're done. We're done here." And I finished off the game. I pulled an all-nighter and I was up to about 2 o'clock in the morning. And I dialed back a number of things that I had done and took it down to a place where I'm actually finishing it out, and I will be releasing this game and talking about it in Airwindows. I'll start a little game section on Airwindows now that I have two entries, because I had Counterpart first, and now I'll have this other one, probably going back to the name Clusterfluff, because why not? Here's the thing, is when I'm pursuing something like that, the end result is never arrived at from, like, compiling a list of the stuff that is supposed to have and then including all the things. You wind up with just like processed cheese that way. You wind up with just something that is deeply uninspiring. It doesn't speak to you. Whereas if you have an instrument, like, I'm not sure if you can see it behind me. You see the yellow guitar? I'll switch over to screen flow. You can see the yellow guitar. That yellow guitar there is inspiring in a particular kind of way because it's sort of like a piece of junk. It's all abraded away, and it's a Telecaster style. It has some hum on the pickups, and there's this just, you really feel that the strings are vibrating wires, and you get a very deep sense of what's going on there. You can distort it, you can compress it, it can be clean, it can be kind of dirty. And it is a very inspiring instrument, that one. That's why it's moved closer to the center of things here. When you're doing something creative like that, and I'm not talking like an accounting software or a website to deal with as many people as possible. I'm talking about like you're making something like a game. You're making a song. You're making something that is creative and needs to have its own identity. You're not done just when you've added all of the stuff. You're done when you've taken away all the things that distract from what the essence of the thing is. And that's what I did with this game, which I don't know if I can pull it together maybe during the next week or two. I can put it out, because in talking to my brother about this, I had the final idea. I'll even use a piece of paper, and then when I've finally done it, what I'll do is I'll do a video of it, and that can be an Airwindows video too. And in that, I can show people how the game works. So you've got this game, and you've got like a series of sort of game pieces at the bottom of the screen, and then there's some obstacles. It's actually a watercolored background that I drew, and then I've got physics objects. So some of the things that I've drawn in the watercolor are physical obstacles, and the game pieces have to go up to win. All the game pieces go up off the top of the screen in order to win. And as you start, there's this little burst of small ping pong ball-like things that come bursting out from the center as you begin the game. And they have a little bit of gravity. The game pieces are constantly moving, and they move at a steady rate, and you can steer them. You select them with the keyboard. You pick a letter and type it, and then you get control of that particular one. And then you use the arrow keys to steer it, and you want to make them all go up. They will wind up all bouncing around and moving fairly randomly. And if you waited long enough, many of them will actually go up off the top of the screen. So the game will like defeat itself if you gave it infinite time. But the little ping pong balls that go flying around are also plainly visible. But when they come to a complete stop, they disappear. And when all of them have disappeared, you're done. Game over. You can no longer control the ones that you're supposed to be able to control, and they gradually slow down and stop. And the whole idea of the game was based off of this idea of, I'm tired of using mice with the game. I tried using a mouse and counterpart, and it was different every computer that I ran it on. And I'd like to do one where you can just control it with the keyboard, which everybody's got a keyboard. And it was also based on the idea of controlling many things at once and making it so that getting a sense of the situation, like, okay, these guys are moving around up here, and then there's one that's moving down here, and that needs to go up. So I need to select the one that's moving here, identify what letter it is, and tell it, like, up, up, up with you. And the more game pieces are moving around, the harder it is to keep track. And it was always going to be about the situational awareness of stuff. Now, I added additional things the entire time, like the game pieces developed a sort of highlight visual thing. My other brother saw the game, got actually interested in it, and then was like, they need to be like little animals running around. And I kind of cringed and went, because it was a kind of distraction and a kind of complicated that I simply didn't want to have it be part of it. I had it set up so that if you selected the guys and had built up enough score, you could hit the space bar, and the letter would flip upside down and then fall up rather than down, because at the time I had gravity so that they would all be pulled downwards. And the ping pong balls bouncing around, the timing balls as I call them, also have gravity, so they will tend to fall down and get lodged in things and then disappear once they've come to a complete stop. And if you run into the timing balls with the controllable ones, you bounce them around quite violently and they keep moving. So the game ended up being, you're controlling these game pieces and making them go up at the top, and you're selecting them each in turn and trying to keep the timing things bouncing around and staying moving, but they're falling down and you're going up. So eventually you're going to wind up with trying to steer these guys that are up here, and there's a timing thing that's coming to a halt down there, but you're never going to be able to reach it in time. And that is how you lose this game that seems very simple, of just all you have to do is select the various game pieces and tell them to go up. Also, there can be big obstacles. Like, for instance, there's levels where Now you bounce off of this, so you have to go up and up to here. So you're steering around through this and then go up there. Or you could have a situation like this, imagine this in here, where if something is coming in this direction, because of the shape of this thing, stuff will tend to bounce back out of it again. You have to aim it correctly to go up. So there's different levels of difficulty on that as well. But when I finished the game, because I got frustrated with my brother saying, "You don't think," and just was like, "No, I'm gonna intuit this out and figure out what's necessary." I took out the gravity for the game pieces. I took out the way that they would flip upside down again and removed all of that stuff entirely from the code. It just went away. And just balanced and calibrated it until it was doing the thing and presenting the problem where it's seemingly very simple. It's seemingly very easy. All you got to do is select these things in turn and tell them to go up. And then you wind up losing the game and going like, "Oh, I ran out of time because these disappeared." And I'd also been stuck for what music to use for it. And the thing about the music problem for this game was I was trying to figure out what kind of thing I wanted. And it turns out that using the timing balls that disappear, and it starts out with like X number of them, is part of the answer for the music thing. Because if the, oh God, people are following up with all of this stuff that I have to tell them no. If you have like 32 of these little game pieces zipping around, but they disappear as you go, if you cycled through all of them in order and played a note of a melody, and then if that one that you were on had disappeared, you put a rest instead of the note, you'd wind up with a nice little tune like that is your background music. And then as the timing things start to disappear, you start getting dropouts, like tape dropouts, where the melody starts having these gaps, these spaces in it, and that's what tells you you're running out of time. Without even necessarily looking at them. By hearing them, you can hear that you just lost a bunch of timing things, and a bunch of the notes just dropped out. Now you're trying to go up, but there's like only 3 notes left of the 32 that you started with. And that's the answer to the music problem, which is how do you put a background music to this curious little game? And the answer is you tie it to some of the game mechanics that are fundamental to how it works. So, and that I'll be doing that in the next couple of weeks or so. And once I finish doing that, I post that game and most likely start on the next one, because one of the things that was a little difficult, and I think it's very unlikely Dan will ever see this, like the rest of my family, nobody pays attention to anything that I do unless it's their thing. So Dan will never see this podcast, or will never see this live stream. But I'm more or less implied without saying it directly that the next project I have in mind, I'm going to have to do myself, much like this one was done myself, and one much like Counterpart was done myself. We've never been able to successfully collaborate on something other than like getting the VST plugins figured out so that I could start using them. And I have hopes that he can help me get like VSTs with GUI figured out. Or if I need to start developing stuff for a Reaper, he'd be the person who would be able to get that figured out. But when it's the creative thing, like making a game, or like if I was recording one of my Tuesday music jams and stuff, he can't help me with that. He wouldn't know where to start. And everything that I'm doing as far as like trying to find a inspiring creative output that feels like its own thing and stuff is an alien language to my brother. He's rationalizing through stuff in the way that he can solve the problems of something that needs to be figured out step by step and done correctly. And artistic stuff, there's no such thing as correctly. Artistic stuff, it has to have a resonance. It has to, what he ended up settling on as far as describing what I was doing, because he had not wanted to hurt my feelings by telling me that I didn't think. And I knew it. I knew he didn't mean to hurt me in that way. It just did, because it was like, this is not as random as you think. And I was trying to explain stuff like Eno's Oblique Strategies cards. We looked up a website where he was able to go online and read some Oblique Strategies cards, and they were saying things like Ghost Echoes, or is it new? I'm sure you've heard of Oblique Strategies. If not, it's worth looking up. It's Brian Eno's thing where you'd have a deck of cards and you draw a card, and it says a sort of aphorism. It says a sort of Zen-like saying, and the idea is that inspires you to do a thing. And Dan's first reaction to that was, oh, so it instructs you to do a thing. And it's like, no. Here's the thing. It could be telling you something that clashes with what you had in mind so much that it clarifies what you meant to do. Like with me doing this thing and trying to make a game based on moving these pieces around. And then you go, oh, well, here's what you do. You put a touch thing so that you can just touch them all with your finger and pull them in the right direction. And it's like, cool, but that's the opposite of the problem I was trying to produce. And in the course of explaining to Dan about this, I got the idea for the soundtrack that was a sequence of notes that is being produced by the timing balls. And then, it would be like a sort of little carillon. Ding, 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 ding. And then as they disappear, you start hearing the gaps. And that tells you how many of these other game pieces are left. And you could have a Oblique Strategies card that tells you to do the opposite, and it's just as good as long as it's able to prompt you in the direction that you need. And it's the same thing with, Dan was like, you seem to try things at random and not think, and then you pick the thing that works, and that's not really programming, and it's like, yeah, but I'm trying to do, and maybe experimenting with things in such a way that I want to see how it feels to play, because we're still talking about making the game. Although plugins can also be like that in many ways. And I want to feel what it is like to play. And then as I do that, I'll know either this feels more like what I wanted, or this is totally the opposite of what I wanted. It's terrible. We did another one. Imagine that this is vertical now, right? I coded an entire game, which is what Clusterfluff actually is now. In fact, the GitHub repository, I think, has all the original versions of this. So if you went through the builds, you'd be able to see the places that this has been. And I had code that created a river between two banks that was extremely long. It was procedurally generated. And you had these sequences of, you had like 26 different river shapes that you could use. And it assembled them in this particular way by being able to make a much longer one rather than just a very short game course. And the idea was to have it continue, and then you'd have a single game piece that was a tanker. It started out as a tanker. And you'd make it go forwards, and things would start scrolling. And then there'd be another tanker parked here, and as you passed it, you'd be able to type B. This would be A. You'd be able to type B and control that one, and then you'd have two of them going. And you'd increasingly have to start steering multiple ones. And they steered like boats. They moved very slowly. And you had it so that you could have, you'd hit, like one's down here and one's up here, and you'd hit the key for this one, you'd be like, boop, up to here, you'd see its environment, and then click, boop, up to there. And I built it and made it work. And as soon as I started playing it, I realized it was terrible because you immediately lost track of what anything was doing, and it wasn't fun at all. And Dan found this very curious, pursuing this very specific thing, and it had to be this river and these obstacles, and you had to generate the river like this, and I had this whole concept. And as soon as I tried it, it was terrible. And I threw it all away. I got rid of the whole river thing. It turned into like, yep, you're in a game screen. It doesn't scroll, nothing happens, and you're just trying to go up off the top of the screen. That is the only problem. Because moving all the pieces around became overwhelming enough that there did need to be whole layers of other stuff going on. And coming to the end of a creative pursuit like that is about having the ideas like, oh, let's have it be boats, let's have it be a river, let's have it be a game board, let's have it be this and that and the other thing. You got to be able to try the things, but then you got to be able to throw away the stuff that doesn't work. And sometimes it's not possible to know that until you're experiencing it. So I did a game that ended up being called Clusterfluff, and it's a variation off of this Tankers one, because the Tankers one I think is actually on the GitHub somewhere or something, but it didn't become a thing. And I told Dan, yeah, I have 3 different games that I could make out of this, and Clusterfluff with moving around the game pieces with the letter written on them, that was one of the options. And the other ones, there was other stuff going on there. It's also being helped by the fact that Blender released a... if anybody's interested in 3D modeling and you haven't heard about the new Blender update, I think 2.8, look into that, because they did a thing where you can set it up with industry standard controls, and they added modality to it so that now you can tell what the heck you're doing, which was never the case with Blender. It never was. Blender required you to learn how it worked and then only, keep all of that in your head, and it was incredibly daunting. And the current version of Blender, you can actually poke around and do stuff with it. So that's very useful. And if I do games that involve 3D models and things, because I understand 3D a little bit better than my brother does. The first one that I did, Counterpart, is actually a 3D based game, but it's in Unity rather than Godot. And Blender is becoming an amazing tool for being able to build stuff like that to use in your own projects. And again, Blender and Godot are open source engines, so it's much like with perhaps to a lesser extent Reaper, since Reaper is a commercial product in its way. But these are things that become very accessible. And when you're building stuff like that, when you're making a game, when you're making a piece of music, it is only partly like identifying this person wants this person wants that. We'll include all of those things in it. And the rest of it is knowing what to leave out, so that as Dan ended up finally saying, in working out like what it was that I was doing and how I knew, because his question was, how do you know that you're done? And of course, the answer to anything creative like that is, well, I'm probably not, because you're never really quite done. But all the same, even though it made no sense to him, I had a really clear sense that I had made great strides towards being way more done than I had been before. And here's why. Because I was removing stuff that didn't relate to the fundamental activity of the game as I had in mind. Like, I removed the stuff that distracted from what you were thinking about, and I had it set up so that as being a game, you're moving these game pieces around, and you're supposed to clearly identify what you're supposed to do, and then you clearly identify what is getting in your way, if anything. And maybe it seems very easy, and then you play it and you lose and go, I lost because this down here was over there and it came to a stop and I ran out of time. and I can see what I would have done differently, and I didn't do the thing. I needed to have something over there so that I would know so that stuff would, you'd be able to clearly identify what was happening, what you needed to do better the next time, and there wasn't a whole layer of other stuff going on. And this is actually something that's affected my mixing, music mixing as well. And I encourage people to bear that in mind. All the time that I was doing music before I started doing the live streams, I was doing stuff like, okay, here is my drums, and then here is my synthesizers, and then here is my guitar one, and then here is a guitar two and stuff. And I would have all these instruments basically just playing along, doing something at all times. I wasn't very good at arranging. And since I was doing just this checklist thing, it didn't enter into it like this song is nothing but a tambourine and a bass guitar and a violin. That never entered into my calculations because I was going like, here is the bass. What do I have the bass doing for 4 minutes? What do I have the guitar doing for 4 minutes? And I would fill in the blanks because I'd be seeing them as blanks. Like, well, I have a guitar, so I should play it and put it here. And it wouldn't really be music. I mean, it would be music, but it wouldn't really work as far as being its own distinct thing because I wasn't leaving enough out. I've had a little better luck with the live stream stuff and the synthesizer stuff because I'm less likely to go, well, I have a Bastel Castle built into the rack and it makes a weird squeechy noise, and so I have to have that squeechy noise going at all times. It's like, no, you don't. In a way, the automation of all that helps because if you have a system where it's like, okay, this is my techno beat, and this is the cymbal sound that goes, if it does that for like 75 minutes, that's going to get boring. So you decide, like, when do I stop that? When do I make that part stop? When do I make the kick drum stop? And that's already leaning more in the right direction. It's like, okay, this stops and this stops and this stops. Now what do I have left? And what is that making me feel like? And that's, it's like that with all of these creative things. So we're getting on towards the end of the stream. It is 12:53, so I'm going to scan over my questions and things. Somebody was mentioning ginger earlier. My breakfast has now been centering around oatmeal with some stevia powder for sweetness and a bunch of ginger powder. So I have this really strong ginger oatmeal every morning now. I can make it with cinnamon as well, and that's okay. But I've really come to like the intensely gingery oatmeal. That is something that I enjoy. I'm sure it powers up your immune system, although you wouldn't hear it. You wouldn't know it to hear me talking today. I'm always kind of worrying about just like burning out or stressing out or being physically impaired because I don't rest enough or I don't blah, blah, blah. Yeah. And Thumper, that's exactly what I was saying. You randomize until you hear settings in the ballpark and then tweak them from there. And this is only awkward when you're dealing with somebody, like my brother who's exploring stuff from a more methodical sense, and they don't have a ballpark. He's like in a small room building stuff out of blocks or like building a foundation out of cinder blocks and has to be working step by step. So there is no ballpark and you can't know what's out there in the ballpark if you're not even there in the first place. That's part of the challenge. Yeah, I know that Reaper is kind of semi-open source, and I hope to be able to look into that more. It's just Reaper is a lot bigger than anything that I do. I get lost pretty easily when I get involved with stuff like that. And when I get lost, I can't do anything. So, one thing at a time, I guess. I have not met the Sound Toys guy. And, if I did an oblique strategies, here, I'll show you. So here's what I did. I went and I got a bunch of decks of cards, and I started writing stuff on the cards. Like this says, repatch, sustained, reverberant. I just took Sharpies and I started writing on the cards with the idea of making some kind of game-like thing out of it, which didn't really work. At least that time it didn't work. Then, but I may be able to come up with something in future, because I did find great places where you could get cards printed up, like for Magic the Gathering or making your own board games or something. And I thought that would be a fun thing to do. So that is another of the many works in progress. And if I'm able to do something like that, it'd be kind of like Oblique Strategies, and it would be kind of like probably a synthesizer-based or modular-based or house/techno music-based music game that you do, where, and it wouldn't be like this, but I've got like on the floor, tea time, jack, regular, swing, techno, rhythm, electro, wat. Wat means do something really strange. Bring it. And I was just trying to do stuff that would be game-like and creative in Oblique Strategies like. Again, it did not succeed this time around, but that doesn't mean I've given up. Maybe I'll come up with something that works better in future. It could be like the game for horrible people, the harsh version of Apples to Apples. It could be something like that, where it's a combination of things. Ideally, it would also work for if you were doing everything in like VCV Rack or whatever. But yeah. And before I go, we've got 3 minutes left, and Ahmed asked what plugins are coming up in upcoming weeks. I'll tell you. Seems like a good question. I am most likely going to be posting Biquad 2 next. That is the biquad where you'll be able to sweep, and it does include being able to sweep a high pass. Somebody was at Cards Against Humanity. That's the one. Purist Era is coming, and I have a friend who asked me for the Hughes stereo reassignment processor, because he had one and used it on Musica Radio, and then it broke. So the thing is that he's going through some personal stuff at the moment, like his dad is sick, and has not got back to me. And I need this guy's reaction to the plugin. I can't simply put it out because it's done to satisfy his needs for this processing again. And he told me, "Oh, thank you so much for doing this for me. I will help support you when it comes out." But that means it's got to be right. So he's got a copy of it because it was made specifically for him. And he needs to give me the go-ahead on that before I can go forwards with it. I can't simply post it. That one is just going to have to wait until he's been able to audition it and stuff has settled down enough for him, and until it is genuinely and really satisfying and exciting for him, not only to have this processing back, but also to have it sound amazing. Because if it doesn't sound amazing to him, like quite legitimately, I don't want to put it out. I'm not going to put it out until it's right. Because he said he would be supportive, and I'm not going to make him be supportive of something that he doesn't believe in. So that one is just going to have to wait. So we've got Purist Air coming. Biquad 2 is coming probably quite soon. The update to monitoring that gives you the Orotone style mixed check speakers on hard left and hard right. And I didn't get a reaction from anybody. I'm sort of warming to the idea of also having a Cans 3 that is just super aggressive. I don't like that, nor do I think people should be using it, but people kept asking me for it and doing things like running multiple copies of monitoring on top of each other and going like, oh, you need to make a version of monitoring that doesn't have the dither, or let me switch it off so that I can run multiple copies and so that I can have a more intense cans. And it's like, that's not what I want you to do. Cans is designed so that it's not messing with the sound so aggressively. It's just very subliminal. And then cans B is just enough that it's changing things for if you're really fatigued and you need to be able to hear stuff. And it's never about taking like stuff that's mixed really badly in stereo and remixing that. It was never about that, but people badly want it. So I might need to add a cans C that's specifically about just that. And, we'll see. I don't know what an OTT style drive to monitoring is. I'm not sure what an OTT is, actually. But there is no drive. Monitoring never gets drive of any kind. Monitoring is just selecting various things, and there's nothing to manipulate because it's just monitoring. It's being able to listen to stuff in different lights rather than adjust or tweak anything. All the adjusting and tweaking would be the rest of your mix. You just switch monitoring on to have a different window onto the sound without really focusing on how do I adjust this window. No, you adjust your sound to the window rather than the window to the sound, or tune in anything about monitoring at all. It's all meant to be just very strikingly different takes on stuff and go from there. I'll be doing some more time-based effects. There will be more. I have not begun to pursue the stuff that I can do with the MIDI verb style reverb effects like all passes and things. I don't even know what OTT means. Arg. Oh, I think I know. It's that Fruity Loops thing, isn't it? Oh, can you do a multi-band limiter style drive to the... No! Yeah, I'll keep teasing you about that if you keep bringing it up. But yeah, I have not begun to explore the stuff that I can do with the reverbs. MV was just a glimpse. It was just a glimpse into what's possible. And although I am still working on, like, if you follow the Instagram, you'll eventually see this. I'm still working on the prospect of getting some serious hardware reverb stuff going. And by that I mean I've lined up a source of spring reverb tanks for dirt cheap. All I had to do was buy 55 of them. And guess what? I've done that, so you're going to start seeing some stuff come out. And I think I've even talked in previous live streams about how I was going to put things like helium in there. I have helium. I'm ready to do some of these experiments. And that's going to be some fun. I've also ordered the kinds of reverb tank drivers I would need. So it's all sort of coming together there. And there are various forms that it could take, but it's mostly about trying to work this stuff out so that I can show people how to do it in a DIY style way. Because I can build them, but since it's me building them and I have to also do Airwindows and I really don't have the time, if I build stuff, it's going to be boutique. And I'll work on like this, coming up with ways of building stuff so that it could be boutique and actually be pretty and nice and worth large amounts of money. And there will be some people out there who will be like, okay, I'll throw large amounts of money for that, and that'll be cool. But what I really care about is putting it into people's hands, so I want to show people how to do that for themselves. And yeah. So on that basis, I think it's about ready for me to... I think maybe I'll fool around with that game idea or something and get that finished, because that's been hanging for a long time, and it's time for me to do something about it. And I'll do another techno jam that's maybe not quite as ruthlessly dance music as last week. I'm on the 75-minute thing where I'm learning to do things. One thing you can see, actually, is over my head, you can see I now have a visible clock. I'd like to put some kind of sensors in there so that I can have stuff going on in the modular system that is literally having the voltages changed by stuff happening on the physical clock. I'm not really quite there yet. Maybe I'll figure it out at some point. It would be pretty cool. Like, little sensors, or, this is grounded, and when it touches this electrical wire inside the clock, then it activates this thing. And so 20 minutes in, you'll have this happen. And I'd like to design that too. I'm not really there yet, but I'll get there. But, yep. Everything is trundling along, as you can see. And I will have a reissue of the Fleetwood Mac's Rumors Evergreen. And I'm going to see whether I can't get all of those pictures up. I mean, the least I can do is just dump all those pictures onto Airwindows, knowing that I'm going to be doing the Evergreens podcast, and there's no reason I can't just throw all the graphics up, and then you can at least see them, And the optical sensors is challenging because remember I do the light show on Tuesdays, so that's going to interfere with optical sensors, and I'll figure something out. So, yep. I will talk to you guys later. And I'll have a couple of things coming out, and I'll see y'all next week. So, bye-bye.